Hello, my name's Rob Edwards. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today we're talking Doctor Who, Season 12, Episode 9, The Ascension of the Cybermen. I'm going to give you my overall sense of the episode, the things which really worked for me, and the things which didn't quite land. But this is a really difficult episode to talk about, because more than any episode that I can think of in sort of recent memory of Doctor Who, this is part one of a two-parter where the entire episode hangs on what happens in part two. This episode was a lot of setup. There was a lot of mystery box elements here, a lot of things that, are they good or not, will rather depend on what the answer to the mystery is. So, in terms of my sort of overall opinion of this episode, I liked it. I thought it was interesting. I thought the mystery was intriguing. But if the resolution to that mystery is bad, then this episode is bad. So I actually find it very difficult to give you my out-and-out opinion of this episode. So in terms of my spoiler review, a non-spoiler review, so that's about everything I can say. Should you watch this episode? Absolutely, you should. If you're planning to watch the season finale, you kind of have to watch this episode. There's no two ways around it, because I suspect the finale episode will make no sense at all if you haven't seen what happened here. But as a standalone episode, it's kind of a bit of a nothing episode, really. I mean, there's lots of incident, lots of stuff happens in it, but it's all kind of empty without the explanations. So let's talk spoilers so I can actually be a little more specific about what I mean by that. First of all, let's do the usual companions, Doctor and guest cast thing. Doctor was great. Nice to see her losing some more. Nice to see the fact that there was consequence for her decision to give over the Cyberium to the lone Cyberman last week. You know, the fact that she is trying to formulate a plan which will protect the last vestiges of the human race, and she has 3 plans, and each one of them is obliterated almost instantly by 9 cyber drones, was great. It was showing that what she did when she went against Jack's advice and gave the lone Cyberman what it wanted, that there were repercussions, there were consequences of that, and I really liked it. I enjoyed the companions this week. The bit where companions get split up because they're being chased and they go in different directions, or one of them stumbles, and it's always a bit kind of hokey, but that aside, I enjoyed the Yaz and Graham pairing. And one thing which I thought was really interesting is that we've seen throughout the 2 seasons of Who with Jodie, that Graham has been the pessimist one. He's been the one to go, why are we running towards this? Why is there never any food on these missions? Why are we really kind of going, this is a silly idea, why should we be doing this? But when he's faced with someone who's also doing that, when he's also faced with a guy who's being the pessimist on the ship they're escaping from the Cybermen in, Graham does not join in. Graham is actually the one standing there going, look guys, we've got to be optimistic about this, we've got to be positive about it, we've got to get through this. And Yaz giving her speech saying, you know, this is something that we can do. That's all great, and I liked both of those elements. Ryan, a little forgettable in this episode for me. I don't know that I have any particularly standout moments for Ryan that jumped to mind particularly. And nothing wrong with his performance, but if anyone was being shorted this episode, it was probably him. Guest cast, enjoyed performances generally overall. I thought the last surviving humans were all kind of interesting. As ever, the more interesting ones died first. So the mute guy and the sort of leader guys, they died, leaving us with the sort of less interesting companions to the companions for the later episode. But, you know, that's kind of par for the course. You know, you make someone interesting so you can kill them off, so that the death matters, that it feels something about it. Yeah, so there we go. That's guest cast of the main plot line. But we also have the Brendan plot line. This mysterious baby found in a street and growing to an age, and then being put into a machine and being tortured, possibly. I have a theory about this. I've as ever, I've watched a couple of reaction videos and sort of reviews of this episode already. I haven't seen anyone say my theory yet for this, but that doesn't mean my theory is not being touted around by other channels that I've not seen yet, or, it could be all over Gallifrey base by now. But I'm going to come back to that, because right at the end today, I'm going to do a little bit of theorying for next episode. As I've talked about in the past before, I'm not one to gatekeep a fandom. If you've only ever seen half an episode of Doctor Who, but really enjoyed that half episode you've seen, you have the absolute right to call yourself a fan of Doctor Who. And the idea that there being such a thing as a real fan of Doctor Who is nonsense. Frankly, you can have watched as much as me, more than me, less than me, and you are a fan of Doctor Who if you think you're a fan of Doctor Who. That said, if there was such a thing as a real fan of Doctor Who, then a real fan of Doctor Who would be a fan of Cybermen. More so than the Daleks, I think. If you're really into your Who, really into the deep lore of Doctor Who, then you've got to be into Cybermen. Because they have, I think, probably more interesting stories, more interesting background, more kind of, body horror elements and all this kind of stuff hanging around the Cybermen. And I loved a lot of what I saw of what they did with Cybermen in this story. This idea that the Cybermen were a huge force and have been all but wiped out in the process of all but wiping out the humans is really interesting. And the fact that we have just this last vestiges of both the human race and the cyber race waiting to sort of find out who is the ultimate winner is really interesting. I liked the new designs that we saw. I like the fact that we've got crusty old Cybermen. Assad with his half conversion was really cool. And the new sort of variations on the Cybermen, the sort of cyber drones, I quite like them flying around as heads of Cybermen. I thought it was quite good. More so than the cyber head that we got in, what was it, the Pandorica Opens? Yes, the Pandorica Opens, when you had this sort of, in the Matt Smith episode, with the head sort of snapping its faceplate, trying to trap Amy. These were much nicer Cybermen drones, and I quite liked, actually I quite loved the new design of the soldier class Cybermen that had a lot of the old sort of 80s Cybermen, or the old classic Troughton Cybermen, invasion style Cybermen look to them, with a much more sort of ridged sides to their faceplate. I actually really like them. I think they look really cool. So yeah, a lot to like there, and I liked this sort of field of dead Cybermen just sort of hanging in space. A little bit strange to have established that we have so few Cybermen left, and then end up on a ship with 100,000 Cybermen just waiting to be activated again. That seems strange. But, okay. I mean, maybe what we actually have there is 100,000 Cybermen shells, and they don't have any organic components in there. And what they need is that. I mean, possibly. Again, this is a mystery box episode, so it's hard to judge without having seen what comes next. But yeah, I'm a big Cyberman fan. I've always been a big Cyberman fan. They are my favourite Who monsters, and it is nice to see them being given a chance to shine. Never mind. So, loved that. That was great. And right at the end, of course, we have the Master back. He jumps through the portal and says, that was a good entrance, wasn't it? Actually, I'm not sure it was. When we saw Gallifrey, I was almost sort of half expecting to see the Master, and jumping through the portal wasn't a big revelation for me. But, yeah, okay. Good to have him back. I like this version of the Master. Let's see what we get with him next week. I'm looking forward to it. So there we go. What didn't I like about this episode? I've said a lot of things which actually were quite positive about. What didn't I like about this episode? I'm not sure there's much that I can point to that specifically didn't work for me. Except for what I've said already, which is that it's all set up. And again, if the resolution of the setup is bad, then that makes this setup pointless and not a good thing. If the resolution for this setup is great, then this episode is great. So really hard to say at this point whether this is a good episode or a bad episode. But for the moment, it's certainly watchable. I want to finish up with a little bit of theory crafting. Now, this isn't my forte, so apologies if these are a bit weird and out there. But I have 3 things that I want to very briefly touch upon. And they are essentially, who is Brendan, the fate of Graham, and what's the Master know? So first of all, let's cover the Brendan thing first. I've seen a lot of people talk about the idea that he might be the human version of Ashad before he becomes the lone Cyberman. I don't think that works. I'm partly because, he's not called Ashad, he's called Brendan, and also because we don't actually see any kind of tech within that scene, within that plot line, that lends itself to the whole idea of cyber conversion. We see something which looks more like a chameleon arch, to be honest, and that's why my theory is that this is another new incarnation, previously unseen, of the Doctor. Why the Doctor? Well, the timeless child thing seems to be an ongoing thread here, and we have a child here that grows to adulthood and is then reset. Your memories will be gone. You won't remember any of this. You see a character who is dedicated to helping people, wanting to help people, and we see a character that their final fate, their final end, is associated with time, because through his retirement gift, there's this sort of cliche carriage clock idea, and that clock there, literally a timepiece. There is a shot which I particularly lends weight to this idea for me. At the end there, as he's being strapped into the machine, about to forget his life as Brendan, we linger on the clock. And behind the clock is a blue door. And this blue door has a window in it, which looks quite a lot like that window. And underneath it, we have panels in the wood. Actually, this panel is split into 2 rather than being just the one. And the shade of blue of this door is a typical TARDIS shade. And that, for me, the juxtaposition of time and this blue door really says TARDIS to me, and specifically says Doctor's TARDIS to me. And there is a sort of sidebar to this, in that Brendan is ginger. And the whole life, the Doctor, certainly New Who, the Doctor's been disappointed about not being ginger, almost like there's something that he's seeking, something that he half remembers. This is nonsense. But, desperately trying to recapture that previous life of his as Brendan. So maybe Brendan is the Doctor. I think if he is in the Ruth branch of the Doctor's timeline. And I think that's the most likely. Graham. There is in the episode Can You Hear Me, we had a couple of things in there calling back to things which are fundamental to Graham's character. The loss of grace and the emotional suffering he suffered from that, and this ongoing worry about his cancer coming back. And both of those were really highlighted in that episode. And I don't know if it's just me, but both of those things are things that cyber conversion could help with. And I do wonder if what they're setting us up here for an episode where Ashad, the lone Cyberman, could offer cyber conversion to Graham, and that Graham might actually be tempted to take it. I don't know that we are going to go this way. I think it's very unlikely, given what a lovable character Graham is, to have such a tragic end. And we've just done the whole cyber conversion of a companion with Bill. But It would be different. It would be different to be offered and accept cyberconversion as a solution to his problems. All three of these theories I actually hope aren't true, and this one particularly, because I don't want Graham to go this way. But if he did, it would be a strong, tragic ending to his storyline. The final thing I want to talk about is just very briefly my wildest possible theory about what the Master knows. I think that it is potentially possible they could be setting up an idea where somehow the Doctor is responsible for creating Time Lords. And this whole kind of bootstrap paradox, circular time thing, where because she gives the Cyberium to the lone Cyberman, and therefore the Cyber Wars start up again, because humans are fleeing through this portal which sends them somewhere else in the universe, possibly somewhen else in the universe, I think it's possible, but not likely, that some of those humans have been sent back to a prehistoric Gallifrey and have become the prototypes of the Time Lords, having been granted access to time through this portal, which looked a bit, not a lot, but a bit like the untempered schism we saw when we saw the backstory for the Master on Gallifrey way back in David Tennant's era. Don't think this is true, but it has a certain poetry to it, and it certainly would quite neatly tie in this idea of the Cybermen returning to Gallifrey, and no, I don't think this is true, but I think it's interesting, and that, that's enough for me. Anyway, that's enough wild theory crafting from me. Points for me if any of that's true, although I rather hope none of it is. If you want to see more from me, then Doctor Who stuff here, writing stuff here, subscribe, and I will catch you next week. Cheers.